Somewhere beneath the sands of southern Egypt lies a body that kept a secret for 3,000 years. For most of that time, historians assumed the man inside those linen wrappings had simply grown old and died quietly in his sleep. A warrior king finally at peace after a long and glorious reign. Then, in 2012, a team of researchers switched on a CT scanner, and in a matter of seconds, the secret his own embalmers had worked so hard to bury came apart completely. This is the strange, uncomfortable truth hiding underneath the golden image of the pharaohs. In their own time, they weren't simply kings. They were gods walking among ordinary men, the living link between heaven and the Nile, rulers whose word alone could reroute a river or send an army marching to its death. And yet, strip away the temples, the towering statues, the gold masks carved to look eternal, and what modern forensic science has found underneath the wrappings is something far more human than anyone expected. Slit throats, shattered skulls, poison, disease eating away at bone, betrayal from the very people who should have been the last to turn against them. In one case, even a hippopotamus. For thousands of years, these deaths were buried twice, once in the ground and once again under layers of myth, propaganda, and simple silence. It's only in the last few decades, with CT scanning, X-ray imaging, and DNA analysis, advanced enough to look straight through thousand-year-old bandages without disturbing a single thread, that the truth has finally started to surface. And some of what it reveals is more disturbing than anything an ancient priest could have invented. Before we get into it, if this is the kind of history you come back for, the subscribe button is sitting right there, and turning on notifications means you won't miss whichever one of these we cover next. Now, let's go back to a night in Thebes, somewhere around 1155 BC, when one of the most powerful men in the ancient world was murdered inside his own palace by people who were supposed to protect him. His name was Ramesses III, and by most accounts, he was the last truly powerful pharaoh of Egypt's new kingdom. He spent much of his reign fighting off a wave of seafaring raiders that history now calls the Sea Peoples, invaders who had already toppled other great powers around the Mediterranean and washed up on Egypt's shores looking to do the same. Ramesses beat them back more than once on both land and sea, and for a while at least, he looked less like a king and more like the last wall standing between Egypt and total collapse. The great relief carvings on his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu still show those battles in vivid detail. Soldiers and ships locked in combat, meant to be read for eternity as proof of his greatness. What he never saw coming was that the real danger wasn't waiting on some distant battlefield. It was sitting at his own dinner table. Ramesses had several wives, and one of them, a woman named T, wanted something very specific. She wanted her own son, a prince named Pentawere, sitting on the throne once his father was gone. There was just one problem. Ramesses had already chosen a different heir, a son by another wife entirely. That single decision turned T into one of the most dangerous people in the palace. She began building a conspiracy, quietly pulling in court officials, palace guards, even the king's own physicians and magicians, all of them working toward one goal: removing Ramesses III from power permanently. Egyptologists today call it the Harem Conspiracy, and remarkably, the trial records of the people involved still survive, preserved on a document known as the Judicial Papyrus of Turin. It describes magicians accused of crafting wax figures and love charms to smuggle weapons past the guards, officials who looked the other way, and dozens of conspirators who were eventually caught and punished. Some of them were denied even the dignity of their own names in the trial record. Scribes deliberately renamed several of the accused with insulting pseudonyms before writing down their sentences, a small bureaucratic act of erasing them from history even before they were executed. The plot against the king itself succeeded. Exactly how it succeeded is where the story gets interesting. When Ramesses' mummy was first examined by archaeologists decades ago, nothing about it looked violent. His face appeared calm, almost peaceful, as if he'd simply drifted off. The only strange detail was a thick wad of linen wrapped unusually heavily around his throat, layered far more densely than anywhere else on his body, almost as if someone had gone out of their way to hide whatever was underneath it. For roughly 3,000 years, nobody unwrapped it. The mummy was too fragile and far too important to risk damaging over a hunch. Then, in 2012, an international team of researchers finally ran a full CT scan, and the image that appeared on the monitor stopped everyone in the room cold. Ramesses' throat had been cut so deep and with such force that the blade sliced through his windpipe and both major arteries, and kept going until it struck the bone of his own spine. This wasn't the result of a struggle. It wasn't an accident. It was a single, deliberate, almost surgical cut, the kind of wound left by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and wanted to make absolutely certain the king did not survive. The embalmers preparing his body for the afterlife clearly knew what had happened to him, and they made a decision. No one else needed to know. A god-king murdered inside his own home was not a story ancient Egypt wanted told, so they wrapped the wound in layer after layer of linen and sent him into eternity, looking serene. It worked for 3,000 years, right up until a machine that can see through cloth, skin, and time finally caught up with what they'd hidden. As for the conspiracy itself, DNA testing on a second, unnamed mummy discovered nearby, a young man buried without the usual royal preparation, his face frozen in what looks like agony, wrapped in the skin of a goat, a material considered ritually impure in ancient Egypt, has led many researchers to believe this is Ptolemy himself, denied even a proper burial as his final punishment. If Ramesses III's murder shows how even a pharaoh's own family could turn against him from the inside, the death of Seqenenre Tao shows something rawer still, violence that came from the outside, in the middle of open war, and left marks that are still visible on his face today. Seqenenre Tao ruled roughly 3,500 years ago, during one of the darkest chapters in Egyptian history, a period when Egypt wasn't really one country at all. It had split in two. The fertile northern delta had been seized by a foreign power known as the Hyksos, ruling from their capital at Avaris and treating native Egyptians as subjects in their own land. Meanwhile, from the southern city of Thebes, Seqenenre Tao held a much smaller, weaker throne, technically a king, but constantly humiliated by the Hyksos rulers who considered him little more than a vassal. One fragment of an old Egyptian story, preserved on a papyrus now known as the Quarrel of Apepi and Seqenenre, claims that the Hyksos king Apepi once sent Seqenenre a bizarre, deliberately provocative message, complaining that the hippopotamuses in a sacred pool near Thebes, hundreds of miles from his own palace, were somehow disturbing his sleep and demanding Seqenenre do something about it. The papyrus is damaged and breaks off before we ever learn how Seqenenre responded. But the message itself reads like exactly what it probably was, an insult dressed up as a complaint, testing how much humiliation the southern king was willing to swallow. By most accounts, Seqenenre Tao was the first to say no. He refused to keep bowing, and many historians believe he was the one who lit the spark of the war that would eventually reunite Egypt under native rule again. He didn't live to see how that war ended. When his mummy was uncovered centuries later, it was unlike almost anything archaeologists had encountered before. Most royal mummies were prepared with enormous care, limbs straightened, faces composed into something dignified and eternal. Seqenenre's body was nothing like that. His embalmers didn't even have time to properly straighten him out. His face is still twisted today, his jaw still hanging open, as though the final scream of his life had simply frozen into the mummified flesh forever. For a long time, people assumed he'd died in the ordinary chaos of battle. But when modern CT scanners and forensic analysis were finally turned on his skull, the picture that emerged looked far more deliberate than a chaotic fight. He hadn't been struck once or twice. He'd been hit from multiple directions with several different weapons. The first blow came from a heavy axe, straight into his forehead, hard enough to cave in the bone and drive fragments into the brain. Then something narrow and sharp, a dagger or spear point, was driven into the side of his neck. A third, blunt weapon crushed his cheekbone entirely. Wound after wound covered his skull, far more damage than a single opponent in a fair fight would ever need to inflict. What truly caught the forensic team's attention, though, was the position of his arms. In almost every other royal mummy, the arms are crossed neatly over the chest in the traditional pharaonic pose. Seqenenre's arms were twisted unnaturally behind his back, locked rigidly in place. The most likely explanation is as simple as it is disturbing. His hands had been bound behind him before he died. That single detail changes the entire story. This wasn't a king cut down in the disorder of combat. He had been captured first. Someone, whether enemy soldiers or a traitor within his own camp, tied his hands, forced him down, and then let a group of men take turns finishing the job with whatever weapons were on hand. His body had likely already begun decomposing in the heat by the time embalmers received it, which may explain why they rushed the process and never bothered correcting his twisted, frozen expression. There simply wasn't time. His death wasn't wasted. When his sons Kamose and Amose grew old enough to understand exactly what had been done to their father, that fury became the fuel for a war that didn't stop until the Hyksos were driven out of Egypt entirely, closing one of the darkest chapters in the country's history and opening the door to the new kingdom that would follow. Seqenenre never had any control over how his life ended. His fate was decided by other men on a battlefield he didn't choose. A few centuries later, we find a pharaoh who never had much control over his life either, though for an entirely different reason, because of choices his own ancestors made long before he was ever born. This is the story of the single most famous name in Egyptian history, tied forever to one of the most misunderstood legends of the 20th century, the so-called Curse of the Pharaohs. I'm talking about Tutankhamun. When British archaeologist Howard Carter finally broke through into Tutankhamun's untouched tomb in 1922, after years of searching funded by his patron, Lord Carnarvon, the discovery stopped the world in its tracks. Room after room of solid gold treasure sat exactly as it had been sealed more than 3,000 years earlier, untouched by looters, waiting. When someone asked Carter what he could see as he peered through a small opening by candlelight, his reply became one of the most quoted moments in the history of archaeology. Almost overnight, Tutankhamun went from a minor, largely forgotten boy king to the single most famous pharaoh who ever lived. Just a few months later, when Lord Carnarvon died unexpectedly from an infected mosquito bite he'd nicked while shaving, newspapers around the world ran wild with stories of an ancient curse protecting the tomb, and the legend has followed Tutankhamun's name ever since. But underneath all that myth sat a genuinely unanswered question. How does a king with that much power, wealth, and prestige end up dead at just 19 years old? For most of the 20th century, rumor filled the gap where facts should have been. Some believed a jealous general or advisor poisoned him to seize power for himself. Others imagined a dramatic chariot accident, the young king thrown from his vehicle at speed. It made for compelling headlines, but none of it was confirmed until 2010, when scientists finally used DNA testing and full-body CT and 3D scanning to look for real answers. What they found wasn't a murder plot or a heroic accident. It was something considerably sadder. The DNA results confirmed something long suspected, but never proven. Tutankhamun's mother and father were full siblings. His father was almost certainly the mummy known today as KV55, widely believed to be the pharaoh Akhenaten, and his mother was identified through genetic markers as the mummy known as the Younger Lady, a full sister of that same man. Marrying within the royal family, brothers to sisters, sometimes even fathers to daughters, was accepted practice in ancient Egypt, done deliberately to preserve what the royal family believed was their divinely pure bloodline. Biology, unfortunately, doesn't share that belief system. Generation after generation of close intermarriage dramatically raises the risk of severe genetic disorders in the children born from it, and Tutankhamun appears to have inherited the worst of that legacy. From birth, the boy king was frail, sickly, and physically compromised, with a mild cleft palate and slightly overbitten teeth, features that also appear in artistic depictions of his father's side of the family. The 3D scans revealed a serious congenital deformity in his left foot, a condition that would have forced him to walk with support for his entire life. This isn't speculation. Inside his tomb, archaeologists catalogued more than 130 walking sticks, many of them worn smooth from genuine daily use rather than sitting there as ceremonial decoration. The scientific team also pieced together what likely triggered his death. At some point, a bone in his already weakened left leg broke, and his immune system, compromised by generations of inbreeding, wasn't strong enough to fight off the infection that followed. As if that alone weren't enough, traces of malaria parasite DNA were also found in his remains, suggesting he was fighting a raging fever from malaria at the exact same time his leg wound was turning septic. A boy who, on paper, had the resources of an entire empire behind him, simply didn't have the physical strength to survive both at once. In a dark chamber, on a bed rather than a battlefield, the most famous king in history died slowly and in real pain, worn down by his own body, long before an assassin or a chariot ever got the chance. Tutankhamun's fate was written into his bloodline before he ever drew his first breath, decided entirely by other people's choices. A few centuries later, we find the opposite kind of ending altogether. A queen who, when everything else in her life had already been decided by other people, made absolutely sure that her death, at least, would belong entirely to her. This is the story of the last and most famous pharaoh in Egyptian history, a woman whose intelligence and political skill are still debated more than 2,000 years later, Cleopatra. It's 30 BC. Rome's shadow has fallen completely over Egypt. A year earlier, at the Battle of Actium, the combined fleets of Cleopatra and her partner, the Roman general Mark Antony, had been crushed by the forces of Octavian, and the two of them had fled back to Alexandria to make a final stand. Antony, hearing a false rumor that Cleopatra had already died, took his own life in despair, reportedly dying in her arms once the mistake became clear. Now, Octavian's army had taken the city itself, and he had one goal left: capture the queen alive, drag her back to Rome in chains, and parade her through the streets as the ultimate trophy of conquest. Cleopatra was never going to allow that. To her, dying entirely on her own terms was infinitely preferable to living as someone else's prize. For centuries, the popular version of her death has bordered on the romantic. As Roman soldiers closed in, the story goes, a basket of figs was brought into her chambers, and hidden among the fruit was a venomous snake. Cleopatra is said to have let it bite her deliberately, and to have died from the venom soon afterward. Ancient writers even claimed she had spent time studying poisons on condemned prisoners beforehand, searching for the method that would kill her with the least amount of suffering. Modern toxicology, though, pokes enormous holes in the snakebite version specifically. Venom doesn't produce a clean, peaceful death. It attacks the nervous system or the bloodstream, and the person on the receiving end typically suffers, convulses, and struggles visibly before the end comes. Yet Roman soldiers who entered her chambers afterward reportedly found her lying in full royal dress, composed and still, without any visible sign of pain on her face. On top of that, no single snake could realistically deliver a fatal, evenly measured dose of venom to 3 separate people in a row, because Cleopatra didn't die alone. 2 of her attendants died right alongside her, in what looks far more like a shared, planned death than an accident involving one smuggled animal. The theory most historians lean toward today is less poetic, but considerably more deliberate. Cleopatra was one of the most educated women of her era, with a genuine, well-documented interest in chemistry, medicine, and toxicology. Researchers now believe she likely arranged a carefully measured mixture, something combining hemlock, wolfsbane, and opium, potent enough to bring death quickly and with minimal suffering. The snake story may well have been invented afterward, quite possibly by the Romans themselves, adding a touch of the exotic and mythical to an enemy they had never quite managed to fully conquer while she lived. Cleopatra lost the war, but she made absolutely certain Octavian never got the chance to parade her through Rome. She died as a pharaoh on her own terms, exactly the way she intended. Roughly 1,500 years before Cleopatra ever sat on Egypt's throne, another woman ruled the same kingdom, though she chose to present herself not as a queen, but as a king in her own right, complete with the same ceremonial false beard male pharaohs wore in official art. Her name was Hatshepsut, and by around 1458 BC, she held enough authority that she had herself depicted with all the traditional symbols of male kingship, unwilling to soften her power just because of her gender. She commissioned towering obelisks at Karnak, built a magnificent mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, designed by her steward and chief architect Seqenenre, and sent a famous trade expedition to the distant land of Punt, returning with incense trees, myrrh, and exotic goods that were carved in detail onto her temple walls. After her death, though, later rulers, quite possibly her own stepson and successor Thutmose III, ordered many of her monuments defaced and her name chiseled out of official records, an act some Egyptologists read as a deliberate attempt to erase her unconventional reign from history. It very nearly worked. For a long time, nobody actually knew which mummy in Egypt's collection was hers at all. That mystery wasn't solved until 2007, when researchers matched a single tooth found inside a small wooden box to a gap in the jaw of a previously unidentified mummy, finally confirming her identity for certain. When that mummy was CT scanned, the results surprised almost everyone. In life, Hatshepsut appears to have been an overweight woman living with diabetes and chronic, wearing pain throughout her body. The real twist, though, came from something much smaller than a mummy, a tiny cosmetic jar found among items connected to her. Chemical analysis of the dried residue inside it revealed that the lotion Hatshepsut used on her skin, likely to soothe some kind of chronic irritation or eczema, contained a compound called benzoperine, known today as a potent carcinogen. Researchers now believe the very cream she rubbed into her own skin every single day, trying to keep herself comfortable and well, may have slowly been giving her cancer the entire time. Scans of her remains show damage consistent with cancer that had spread through her spine. A woman who ruled with as much confidence as any king in Egyptian history may ultimately have been undone by her own medicine cabinet. A queen undone by her own beauty routine is one kind of irony. What happened to a very different kind of pharaoh generations later is almost the reverse of it. Not a hidden poison working quietly in the background, but simply the plain, undeniable weight of time. History remembers him as Ramesses the Great or Ramesses II, and when he died around 1213 BC, he was nearly 90 years old, having sat on Egypt's throne for an almost unbelievable 66 years. His reign is still remembered for the massive rock temples at Abu Simbel, for the Battle of Kadesh against the Hittite Empire, one of the largest chariot battles in recorded history, and for the peace treaty that followed it, one of the earliest written peace agreements in human history, copies of which still survive in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and Hittite cuneiform. He is also remembered more informally for having fathered somewhere around 100 children across his many wives, including his famous queen, Nefertari. That kind of power and longevity sounds enviable on paper, but his final years were anything but comfortable. When scientists examined his mummy, the scans showed a spine curved forward by decades of age, and every major joint in his body stiffened with arthritis. His worst suffering, though, came from his mouth. A severe bacterial infection had eaten away at his jawbone, carving out a painful abscess that would have made even simple things like eating agonizing. The man whose statues were carved to tower over temple entrances for eternity spent his final months as a frail, aching old man, worn down not by an enemy or a conspiracy, but simply by the 90 years his body had carried him through. Old age wasn't the only quiet killer to claim a pharaoh, though. One of the later Ramesside kings was brought down by something so small it's invisible to the naked eye. His name was Ramesses V, and he died around 1145 BC at only about 30 years old, after a short and fairly uneventful reign, remembered today mostly through an administrative document called the Wilbur Papyrus, a detailed land and tax survey that shows Egypt's bureaucracy still running smoothly, even as its later Ramesside kings grew weaker and less remembered. When his mummy was studied, researchers noticed something strange scattered across his face and body. Small, raised marks, almost like blisters, that had somehow stayed visible on the skin for nearly 3,000 years. Medical researchers who examined these marks concluded they closely resembled the lesions caused by smallpox. If that identification holds, and some debate about it still continues, Ramesses V may represent one of the earliest documented cases of smallpox in recorded human history, killed not by a rival or a blade, but by a virus that had absolutely no idea it had infected a god. Disease and old age had already claimed their share of these kings. What happened to Cleopatra's own younger brother came from somewhere else entirely, not from within the body at all, but from nature at its most indifferent. This is the story of Ptolemy XIII, part of the Greek-descended Ptolemaic dynasty that had ruled Egypt since the death of Alexander the Great, a family that had adopted the old pharaonic custom of siblings marrying and ruling together. Ptolemy co-ruled Egypt alongside his older sister, Cleopatra, until the two fell into open conflict, a rivalry that eventually pulled Julius Caesar himself into Egyptian politics after he arrived in Alexandria chasing his defeated rival, Pompey, only to find that Ptolemy's advisors had already had Pompey killed in a doomed attempt to win Caesar's favor. At just 15 years old, Ptolemy found himself at war, not only with his sister, but effectively with Rome itself. When it became clear he was losing, he ran for the Nile, hoping to escape by water. Unfortunately for him, the river happened to be in the middle of a violent flood. In the panic, Ptolemy crowded onto a boat already carrying far more people than it could safely hold. Between the raging current and the overloaded hull, the boat capsized in open water. According to ancient accounts, Ptolemy was wearing heavy ceremonial golden armor at the time, the kind of thing meant to make a king look untouchable in front of his own soldiers. Instead, it dragged him straight to the bottom of the river. There was no golden coffin waiting for him afterward, no temple built in his memory, just a river that didn't particularly care that he was supposed to be a living god. To close this out, we go all the way back to where Egyptian history, as we understand it, actually begins, roughly 5,000 years ago, to the very first king credited with uniting the entire country under a single crown. Egyptologists generally identify him with a ruler named Narmer, best known today through an ancient carved ceremonial slate called the Narmer palette, discovered in 1897 at the temple site of Hierakonpolis. On one side of that palette, the king wears the white crown associated with Upper Egypt. On the other, he wears the red crown of Lower Egypt, an image most historians read as a literal or symbolic record of the two lands being joined together for the first time. Later Egyptian tradition, preserved centuries afterward by the priest and historian Manetho, refers to this same founding figure by another name entirely, Menes. Remarkably, No mummy belonging to him has ever been identified, and how he actually died remains completely unsolved. What has survived is an old, unsettling account passed down through that same later tradition. According to it, the man who first brought Egypt together met his end at the jaws of a hippopotamus. The story goes that Menes was standing near a riverbank when an enraged hippo lunged out of the water, seized him, and dragged him under. In Egyptian mythology, the hippopotamus wasn't simply a dangerous animal. It was closely associated with Set, the god of chaos and disorder. There's something almost too fitting about the story, whether or not it's literally true. A king who spent his life imposing order onto chaos, only to have chaos itself, wearing the shape of an animal, be the one to finally take him. Line up all 9 of these deaths side by side, and a pattern starts to emerge that's hard to ignore. These were men and women who built pyramids and temples meant to outlast time itself, who insisted they were living gods, whose word alone could bend the course of a river or decide the fate of thousands. And in the end, none of it mattered. One was murdered by people inside his own household. Another was executed on a battlefield with his hands bound behind him. One was betrayed by his own bloodline before he ever had a real chance to live. One chose death on her own terms rather than let an enemy choose it for her. One may have been slowly poisoned by the very thing meant to heal her. Others were simply worn down by age, by disease, by deep water, or by an animal that had no idea who it was attacking. Gold and titles couldn't save any of them. Underneath everything, they were exactly what the rest of us are: flesh, bone, and time, running out the same way it does for everyone, god, king, or otherwise. If one of these stories stayed with you more than the others, drop a comment and let me know which pharaoh's death you found the most unsettling. And if this kept you watching until the end, a like helps more than you'd think, and sharing it with someone who's into this kind of history goes a long way too.